Welcome to the Connected Leadership Podcast live. I'm Andy Lapata. We are now in a run of me recording some shows for when the podcast comes back in February, probably, of next year. So the podcast has finished for 2021, and we're now getting some episodes all in the vault ready for relaunch early next year. So we've got 3 live broadcasts in 3 days for you on 3 very different topics with 4 very different guests. So this is the first one. If you want to know which the other episodes are, tomorrow's is already up on the 3 channels that we're streaming in: YouTube, Facebook, and LinkedIn. The third will be up probably tomorrow, but we've got tomorrow. We are looking at how much you can share your personal life with your professional network, and that's with Kelly Molson and Paulina Tenner. Kelly has shared a lot about her journey battling trying to conceive and working with IVF for many years, alongside her work as a founder and MD of a digital agency. And Paulina is a former burlesque dancer who's written a book all about what business can learn from the stripper. And obviously it's very interesting to find out just how that works when she's a serial entrepreneur and investor in businesses, but she's got this other narrative about being a stripper and a burlesque dancer. So I think that could be a really interesting conversation tomorrow afternoon. That's at 2:10 GMT UK time. And then on Thursday, I'll be connecting with sunny Carmel in California, my good friend Leslie Everett, the author of Walking Tall, an expert on personal branding. And we'll be looking at the importance of an entrepreneurial mindset in a leadership role inside a larger organisation. So in other words, what can leaders in large organisations learn from the entrepreneurs? So those are your 3 interviews lined up this week. If you are a podcast listener as well as a watcher of the live broadcasts, then we may have stopped publishing podcasts for a few weeks while we relax a little bit over the festive period. But the podcast has, I think we're on 125, 126 episodes. So there's plenty in the back catalogue for you to get your teeth into there. We have got Olympians, Olympic medal winners. We've got an astronaut. We've got a symphonic conductor. We've got senior business leaders with a great CV behind them, and many more. And today we're taking that a step further, and we have our first Nobel Laureate as a guest. So my guest today, who I'll introduce in a moment, is Robert Lefkowitz, or Bob Lefkowitz. Only his mum calls him Robert, just like only my mum calls me Andrew, and even she doesn't do that anymore, Bob. And I was introduced to Bob by our good friend and good friend of the podcast, Ruth Gotian, a couple of months ago, and I immediately went out and bought and read Bob's book, A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to Stockholm. And it's a memoir that leads up to his experience of receiving the Nobel Prize for Chemistry. And I loved it. And you're listening to someone who really did not do very well at school when it came to scientific subjects. I only took 1 science O level because I had to. And I didn't do very well in that one, but I found this book absolutely fascinating, highly recommend it. And as I went through, I was highlighting paragraph after paragraph for the purposes of this podcast. So we might have a slightly longer one than usual, but we're only doing the 1 episode. The shorter episode, as of next year, I'm not going to be publishing anymore. So we got longer potentially if we need it to talk to Bob about his career and everything that's come out of that. Slightly different format to normal. I split the questions into 4 categories, but we'll just see where it takes us, as I always do. In the meantime, I can see we've got a few people joining us live, so please feel free to comment on LinkedIn, comments on Facebook, on YouTube. Tell us who you are, where you're based, and if you've got any questions along the way, if you've got any comments, I will try and weave those into the conversation with Bob as best I can. So let's meet our guest today and have a little chat before we start the podcast interview proper. And as I say, if you're listening in, say hello in the comments. It'll be great to know who we've got on the line. Bob, thank you very much for joining me on the Connected Leadership Podcast.
My pleasure to be here with you today, Andy.
And where are you joining us from, Bob?
Durham, North Carolina, USA.
Carolina. North
home of
Carolina.
Duke, home of Duke University.
Home of Duke, and who I have actually delivered work for out in the Middle East. So with I'm never quite sure, and I'm always very careful how to pronounce it. But I worked with the Fuqua Business School, and
Right.
I hope I pronounced that correctly.
You got to be careful with that one.
I got to be very careful with that one. So, Bob, we're going to talk about just takeaways from the book. I think that I picked up so much from your journey. I have, as I said in the intro, sort of just picked up on four key categories that I think are both you have a lot to offer in those areas, and also they're very relevant to the topic of this podcast. Certainly, the three of those categories are. The fourth is a general. What else do I need to ask you? But doesn't really fit into any of those categories. So we're going to start off by looking at storytelling, because you're a big believer in storytelling, as am I. And I was mentioning to you before we came on air that I was delivering a workshop on mentoring this morning to a client in the Philippines, and I quoted you 2 or 3 times in that. But interestingly, one of the team there, when I started out by asking what that team had learnt from the mentor that had made the biggest impact on them in their career, one of the ladies on the call, her response was, he always gave his advice by telling me stories. And I think that really resonates with what you have to say in the book. The second area we're going to look at is mentoring and leadership. I've really wrapped those two things together. You've mentored over 200 people over a number of years. One of those has gone on to follow in your footsteps and win the Nobel Prize. So I think there's a lot we can learn from you on that as well. And then networks, the professional relationships that you build up over the course of your career. And then we'll pick up general stuff. I think actually before we go into that meat and that detail, I'm going to go straight to the general, because as I mentioned in the intro, you were introduced to, or we were introduced to each other by our good friend Ruth Gotian, and I emailed Ruth yesterday and I said, you do know that I'm doing the interview with Bob tomorrow. And she's sent her apologies. She can't join us live, but she said, ask Bob about where his daughter got engaged. Now, I know the story because I've read it in the book, but it is a funny story, and it's probably quite a unique one as well. So tell us about how your daughter got engaged.
Well, so it is quite an interesting and I think probably unique story. It was December of 2012, and I was in Stockholm to receive the Nobel Prize in Chemistry. And with me, I had brought an entourage, which consisted pretty much almost exclusively of family. I have a large family, 5 children, now all married, and grandchildren, etc. And so that large family was with me. And at that time, 3 of my 5 children were married. Mara, who was my 4th child, a daughter, was not. But she was there with her very serious boyfriend, Eric, and they had been a couple for about 5 years. Well, I was hosting a dinner for this group the night before the Nobel ceremonies. And toward the end of that dinner, Eric, Mara's boyfriend, comes up to me and says, could we step outside for a moment or two? He'd like to talk to me about something. I could see he was a bit nervous, which was not his usual demeanor. He's a very self-confident young man, but I could tell he was ill at ease. So we stepped outside, and after some stammering around, he made it clear that what this was all about was that he wanted to propose marriage to Mara, and he wanted my permission, which right off the bat seemed very quaint to me. I didn't know that anybody ever really ask the father for permission to marry the daughter. But I didn't have to think about it very long, as I described in the book. First of all, they'd been together 5 years. Second of all, I genuinely liked the guy. And I think most importantly, I said to myself, she's not getting any younger. She's 42. Let's grab this opportunity. So I said, sure, go right ahead. You have my blessing. He said, well, I really don't want to take the spotlight off you. This is your moment. He says, so I'll find a quiet, unobtrusive place and way to do it. I said, great. So now fast forward 24 hours. We've had the presentation ceremony, the the fabulous Nobel banquet for 1,500 people, all white tie affair has happened. The banquet is over. As I said, 1,500 people. Now, about 1,000 of us are in a huge ballroom having champagne toasts, and I'm standing with my family, just sort of talking and just sort of soaking in the moment. The king and queen are standing about 100 feet away. And in fact, my wife and I had just had our scheduled few minutes with them. And now I'm back with the family, and we're all standing around, and as we say in Yiddish, schmoozing, if you know that term.
I know that term. Yeah.
When all of a sudden Eric drops to one knee and begins proposing to Mara. Now, this was a total surprise to her. He had instructed me after our conversation to mention this to absolutely nobody. So I'm the only one who knows this is coming. Fortunately, my 12-year-old grandson, realizing that something is going on here, whips out his iPhone and videos the whole thing. And so I have that video. Anyway, immediately the attention of everybody in the area, including the king and queen, is drawn to this sight of this young man on his knee proposing. And meanwhile, all of this is being videotaped by my grandson. And in the tape, you can see other Nobel laureates standing in the background. And all of a sudden, everybody's applauding because they realize what's going on. Of course, my daughter starts to weep and immediately accepts the proposal. And we're all just overjoyed. Meanwhile, I'm keeping an eye on the king over there. And it's clear that he's watching the whole thing. So anyway, the proposal ends. We're all embracing. And the king sends his attaché, a guy in uniform with epaulettes and medals, comes over. And he says the king, was observing this with some interest. He wonders exactly what was going on here. So I explain, this young man has just proposed marriage to my daughter, and she's accepted. Okay, he heads back, and now we're all watching over to the king and queen, and we see the attaché explaining to the king exactly what had gone on. The king, whose own daughter had just gotten engaged, against his wishes, by the way, the previous year, looks over at me, catches my eye, and he goes like this. And I smiled, and that's how my daughter got engaged at the Nobel banquet.
Lovely. For people listening on the podcast, the king gestured with both hands clenched and raised in the air in a sign of success or victory.
Right.
It's a unique story, isn't it? Not many many people can claim that their daughters were proposed to in front of the king and queen of Sweden. Oh, sorry, Norway.
Right.
Norway.
Right.
And it's a lovely one to share. And I asked you that for two reasons. Number one, it is a lovely story, and Ruth nudged me on that in our email exchange yesterday. The second is that your book is full of anecdotes, and it's full of stories like that. That's what makes your book so engaging. And I think both of us are of the same school of thought, that if you've got information to share, if you can bring it to life in a story, and a story can be one or two lines, it doesn't have to be a chapter or a book, but if you can bring it to life in that sense, then they're more engaging for people. So in each of your roles as a physician, as a scientist, and as a mentor to other people, how has storytelling helped you, and how can leaders use stories effectively in whatever they're trying to do to get their message across more effectively?
So this is a very important question. I think some of us are, just by disposition and personality, have more of a tendency to be raconteurs than others. Anybody can develop their skills in this area, but I think some people it just comes more naturally to than others. But I think I was always kind of drawn to storytelling. I loved reading when I was a child. I loved reading stories. Uh, but I think when this was brought home to me in a professional setting, most acutely for the first time, is a story I tell in the book. I was a third year medical student at Columbia, and I was doing my very first clinical clerkship, as it's called. So this was my very first real clinical exposure after the 2 intensive years of basic science medical education. And I had been sent to the Mount Sinai Hospital on Fifth Avenue in New York City. And there I was assigned to the clinical service of a wonderful attending physician named Mortimer Beta, who, as an aside, was an identical twin, uh, who practiced together with his brother. They were pulmonologists. Anyway, very first day of rounds, I was assigned to present the case, which I did. And then there was discussion of the differential diagnosis, and it was interesting, and I thought I had done pretty well, and that we would now move on to the next case. But instead, Dr. Bader stopped me cold by saying, "Okay, Mr. Lefkowitz, now I would like you to represent the case to me. You can't change any of the facts, but I want you to tell me a different story." Well, I was basically, whatever word you want to use, gobsmacked, discombobulated, whatever. I had no idea what he was talking about. I said, "How can I present a different story? I mean, the story is the story." He said, "Well, maybe not so." He says, "You can't change any of the facts, but go ahead." Well, I couldn't do it. So we went around the room asking other students and then the more senior people, the interns, and nobody would take it on. So he said, "Well, let me demonstrate." He then proceeded to tell a rather different story, again, using all the same facts, but putting the emphasis on some features, leaving out entirely other features. And it was a rather different story. And it led to a different differential diagnosis, which, as an aside, turned out to be the correct diagnosis, not the one that my story had taken us to. And so that was my first exposure in a clinical setting to how data, in this case clinical data, are not a story. The story is something you impose on the data with your own analytic abilities and your own creativity. So that was when in the days before I ever dreamed I would become a scientist. But then as a scientist, I learned the lesson was even more acute because what we do as scientists is collect data. But data, not a story. I knew that already. And in analyzing data, you find you can tell many stories. For example, if we're preparing a scientific paper and we have, say, 5 different figures, if you will, of data, graphs, we'll move them around. I mean, you might tell the story beginning with, let's say the figures are A, B, C, D, E. We're going to start with figure A and work our way through to E, and that's a nice story. On the other hand, it might be more effective to start with E and work your way back to A, or maybe start with C. And we'll actually do that. We'll move the panels around. And by doing that, you find out that not all, even though the data is the same, not all stories are equivalent. Some are much more compelling. Some have a bit of suspense. So I would say that in both my clinical work and in my research, the art of telling stories, of putting data together in different ways has been extraordinarily important. And I try to teach that to my students and fellows.
It's interesting the way you approach it as well. It's not as simple a case of present the data in a more compelling way by turning it into a story, but the fact that by analysing that data in the way that creates the story, you can look at it from a range of different directions and come up with different diagnoses in a medical sense, or different interpretations, different perspectives in a more generic sense, and that has to be an important message for leaders as well, doesn't it? That there's not always, it's the old classic line, there's not just one side to every story.
Absolutely, absolutely true. I think it hones your creative powers, trying to look at data from different points of view, and seeing what different stories that you can get from it. And sometimes a story that you discard as not being the best one for this occasion will lead you in another direction, to another discovery. So yes, I think the art of storytelling is so key, and fun. In addition to all that, it's fun, and let's not uh, diminish the importance of having fun in whatever you're doing, because the more fun you're having, the more creative you'll be.
Well, that's right. And I mentioned to you earlier how I delivered this mentoring program this morning, and one of the things that I added into that I took from your book was the importance of having fun with your mentees, and how that stimulates the creative process, how that gets people to engage more. And of course, if you take a traditional leadership presentation, and I can see how this very much works in the medical sphere, but I'm trying to broaden this, and I think this works in any sector, any space. You take a traditional leadership presentation which shows a range of graphs and a range of analytics, in other words, a range of data, and the classic death by PowerPoint where the data is just presented. You can turn that into a story, and it doesn't, when you say fun, it doesn't have to be a laugh a minute moment, but it can be a lot more engaging because you capture the imagination in the process.
Well, I think that's true, but I would emphasize that doesn't hurt if people laugh too.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Right? I mean,
Yeah.
humor has been a big part of my approach to life and to my work. And you know, at my lab meetings, I think, as I point out in the book, I use a lot of humor. I try to get people laughing consciously, because I find the more that people are having fun and are laughing, the more creative they are, and the creative ideas begin to flow. In addition, there's a basic connection, I believe, between humor and the art of discovery. So basically, humor involves perceiving relationships that between seemingly disconnected things or discordant things or things that you ordinarily wouldn't put together, seeing that relationship. And in the moment that you realize that or point that out, it's funny. And in the moment that the listener to what you're saying, which is humorous, in the moment that they get the joke or understand the humor, essentially what they're doing is making a little discovery. They're putting some things together that they ordinarily wouldn't have done. And of course, that's the essence of scientific discovery. So I encourage humor, and I use it a lot myself. But there is a caveat. And the caveat is that basically my observation is that just about everybody has the ability to appreciate humor, but not everybody can be funny. And in fact, my observation is the good Lord created really two distinct types: people who are funny and people who are not funny. And it's very important to have self-awareness as to which category you're in, because, I mean, there's no crime in being an unfunny person. I mean, it doesn't mean you have any less self-worth. But the important thing is, if you're not funny, you have to know that and not try to be funny. Because the caveat is there's nothing more cringe-inducing than an unfunny person trying to be funny. We've all been in that situation. So to your audience, I say this: if you're not funny, no problem. Just don't try to be funny. Just appreciate other people's humor.
It's something that I want to cover in more depth on the podcast next year. One of the plans is for an episode dissecting the role of humour in professional relationships. One of my colleagues, Jeremy Nicholas, who will hopefully be on that podcast, works with speakers to help them inject humour into those speeches. And one of the things he says that I think is very important and really goes to what you're just saying is that you don't inject a joke into the speech, you inject humour. So it's not, now let me tell you this gag with a punchline, because that's where you fall flat. What I've always said when I try and naturally inject humour into a lot of what I do. I create it in a way in my talks where if people don't laugh, I figure they haven't got that it was a joke, and I can move on because I haven't flagged it up as such. And I think that's a very important part of it as well.
Indeed, I completely agree. Most people who know me consider me to be pretty funny. And my whole approach to life
Yeah,
is
yeah,
fun. I see humor everywhere. But I never tell jokes. In fact, if you asked me how many jokes do I know, one or two. That's it. I don't even know any jokes. And I get told jokes all the time. They go in one ear and out the other. Uh, because, yeah, to me, the humor is that you perceive in everyday situations. But, it's interesting what you say about getting the joke. As with most scientific groups, I have a very international laboratory. And so I have people from all over the world. And although English is the universal language of science, and although we all conduct all our business in English, let's face it, people for whom it's a second language can't always, uh, you know, can't always understand all the nuances. And when I'm at my lab meetings and I'll say something funny and everybody is kind of laughing, I'll scan the room.
yeah.
And it's sad sometimes because I can see some of the people who are from other countries, I can see it's gone right over their head. And, they'll kind of, when they realize everybody else is laughing, uh, you know. So anyway, but yeah,
And you've got cultural differences to take into account there as well. What's funny, particularly to Brits and Americans, we have both nations have particularly defined types of humour, which might
oh,
not be.
absolutely. Well, I'll tell you something closer to home. So, when I was preparing to go to Stockholm for the prize, one of the responsibilities I knew I would have was that at the Nobel banquet, the tradition is for one member of each award category uh, to make a 5 minute banquet speech about anything they want, not their science. Some people make up poems and read those, whatever you want to do. If there's more than one winner, as there was in my year, myself together with Kobilka, who was my former trainee, then it falls to the more senior member of the team to make the remarks. So I put together my 5 minute speech and I practiced it. And initially, I had several humorous lines in there because that's what I do. But the more I thought about it, I kept saying to myself, and by the way, if there's anybody from Sweden listening in, no offense, but I said to myself, Swedes, they're not all that funny, and I don't want to bomb by saying something which a few people are going to think is funny, but the Swedes are not going to think it's funny at all. So I scrubbed them out. I didn't say anything funny at all.
It's interesting. I've spoken a lot in Scandinavia, mainly in Sweden, funnily enough, and you do find certain Scandinavian audiences are much colder to receive the information than other more Western audiences. So I remember giving a talk to a group of Finnish bankers, and everyone sat there for the whole session absolutely stone faced. One
Right,
woman kept me going. She gave me the energy because she reacted and smiled
right,
and laughed. Everyone else stone faced. And then
right.
they all rushed off at the end because it was in Dublin and they had a tour of the Guinness factory straight after me. Never be a warm up for a tour of the Guinness factory or the Guinness brewery. And I caught them out by so that I was alone in the room in 30 seconds feeling awful.
Right.
This whole thing has bombed. I walked out and they were waiting for their coach and they all came up to me and from the bottom of their hearts thanked me. And the feedback afterwards they loved it, but they're not a demonstrative
Right.
group. So it's really important to understand that. Same with Norwegian group. I could never get an audience from Norway to interact in breakout exercises. They'll sit there and not do anything, and then the feedback again would be positive. So
And that's very difficult, isn't it, Andy? Because when you're giving a talk, whether it's a hardcore scientific talk, or if I'm giving an after dinner talk in a lighter environment, you read the audience, okay? You pick out people and you make mid-course corrections based on the visual feedback you're getting, okay? And to the extent that, say, the audience is laughing and enjoying themselves, it really helps you. On the other hand, when you got stone faces coming back, it's dispiriting. So I can imagine how difficult that might have been for you.
Well, you always have to understand learning styles. The amount of times I've thought someone has hated my presentation and they've been the one to come up to me at the end to thank me. But it's just their learning style. They close their eyes to concentrate, for example. Oh, we have Justin Phillips is watching on Facebook from Israel, from Jerusalem. So Justin, thanks for joining us. Great to see you. I think first time on one of these live streams, but a very old friend of mine. So it's really good to see you here, Justin. Bob, I've got one more question on storytelling and humour, then we need to move on to some other areas. But certainly in terms of what we try and get to the heart of in this podcast, I think it's key. Do you think that your use of stories and humour has brought you closer personally to patients, to colleagues, to your mentees than you might have done otherwise? What has it done to cement that relationship?
Well, the answer to all of the above is yes, 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 and yes. Let's start with the clinical arena. So when I no longer teach clinical medicine, I did for almost 40 years, but I don't make rounds anymore. But when I used to make what we call teaching rounds together with a coterie of students and house staff, that's interns and residents, I would always try to model certain behaviors. One of them was when I would approach the bedside of a new patient, I'd always sit on the edge of the bed. I'd always make physical contact with the patient, touch them, and I would talk to them, make a lot of eye contact. And I always prided myself, and I would demonstrate it, that at some point during that interview, I would, no matter how ill the patient, even if they were moribund, I could invariably get them to smile or laugh outright. And I felt that was very important. You know, part of being a physician, the most important part is to bring healing. And there are times when you can't even cure a patient, but you can make them, you can relieve their pain, emotional and even physical, in the way that you interact with them. I mean, when you're a patient lying in that hospital bed, and I have been in that position myself as a patient, your whole day revolves around that visit for 5 minutes by the physician or the attending physician. That's the whole focus of your day. And so you need to make the most of that. And telling stories and being able to lift that patient's mood is, an extraordinarily important thing. And storytelling is a big way of doing that. Now, in the research arena, when I'm training my fellows, there is no doubt that one of the things that has brought me closer to them are the personal relationships that I've developed. And so while they're with me, sure, I mean, the main thing I'm doing and supposed to be doing is mentoring them in how to be a scientist, okay? Which, by the way, is not by giving them all sorts of rules. It's by role modeling and just sort of showing them. But we spend a lot of time me talking to them and telling stories. And in fact, the way my book came to be was that for 20 years, my students and fellows, present and past, were pestering me. Bob, you've got to write all these stories down. You've got to do it. And I never would have, frankly, if it wasn't for my co-author, Randy Hall, a former trainee, who finally talked me into doing it with him as a collaborator. So I think in all cases, both in the clinic, the hospital, and in my laboratory, telling stories has been a big part of how I develop personal relationships.
And they've clearly had an impact, because if people say your stories are so compelling, you should write a book about them. I think that's the feedback, that they've had an impression. Well, let's move on to mentoring, because you've talked about the number of people you mentored there, and how you've been doing it for a long period of time. It was interesting picking up from the book that you actually started mentoring at school, by mentoring younger students, interestingly including the former, or at that time, future civil rights activist Stokely Carmichael. And you've now mentored over 200 scientists, as I mentioned earlier. One of them has gone on to win Nobel Prize. Others have won other major research awards as well. What do you think led you down that road originally? Are there particular qualities that you demonstrate that make you a natural mentor? And obviously we've talked about the storytelling and humour, so I'd be interested to dig into what are the other qualities that make someone a natural mentor.
Well, I think, first of all, I think you're choosing just the right word, natural. Okay. Each of us is born with certain gifts and certain deficiencies. And I think a big part of being successful is learning how to maximize your gifts and minimize the consequences of your deficiencies, which we all have. I didn't set out to be a great mentor or a mentor at all. And in fact, when I look back now with the perspective of whatever, more than 50 years of doing whatever it is I do, I realized that, especially in the early years, when I was mentoring some of the people that have gone on to be most successful, I didn't even know I was mentoring, and I never even gave it a thought. Never even is in my mind what I was doing, how I was doing. I'm reminded of a story by my favorite philosopher, Yogi Berra, who was a very famous catcher for the Yankees when I was growing up in New York City. And all sorts of quotes are attributed to him. Who knows if any of them are really true? But anyway, one of my favorites is Yogi was an amazing clutch hitter. He was an amazing hitter to begin with. He had about a 300 lifetime batting average. But bottom of the ninth inning, game is on the line, 2 men on base, down by a run, you could count on Yogi driving in the winning runs. He was an amazing clutch hitter. And somebody once said to him, allegedly in an interview, Yogi, share with us your secrets. What are you thinking when you're up in that very clutch situation and you know you need to get a hit? What are you thinking? And Yogi looked at them with great surprise and said, thinking? He says, how are you going to think and hit at the same time? And so that was sort of what I was doing all those years. I wasn't thinking about doing it. I was just doing it. So how's that possible? It comes to your word natural. It just came naturally to me. I didn't realize I was mentoring. All I knew is I'm a very social person. And I often tell people, if I had had to do my scientific work alone on a desert island with all the resources that I needed, but no other people, no way I could have done it, for a variety of reasons. But most importantly, because for me, it's a social activity. What I love is interacting with people, sharing my ideas, hearing what they have to say, and just, trying to, lead them along the way. So I think a big part of being a natural mentor is being willing to share yourself and your vision and your enthusiasm and passion with others. And I think that's probably one of the main things that worked for me.
That word passion that you used, I think that's absolutely key. I mentioned to you earlier that I took a couple of quotes from your book for the session that I ran this morning on mentoring, and the one that I particularly shared with you was this one where you when you work with a mentee, you put in two key necessary steps that have to be in place. Number one is that they are excited about what they are working on, and number two is that you are excited by what they're working on. And my message to the mentors was, you need to go on the journey with them. You're not just there, okay, you've got an hour in my diary now, what do you need? But you want to be wanting to know their progress all the time. and engage with them all the time, to really make that tick over. I think it's that journey together, and your natural need to engage with others and learn from others and share with others. I think it's part of sharing excitement as well as sharing learning with each other. Sharing your wins, sharing your frustrations is a core part of it.
I think so. And you just mentioned the key word, which I often think about myself. The word you used was journey.
Yeah.
To me, the end result of what we do, which are the scientific discoveries and their consequences, and all of that which led to the Nobel Prize, to me, almost a byproduct of what I do. Uh, to me, it's all about the process of working collectively with my fellows. Uh, and it's almost like we're chopping wood. And the main thing we're doing is chopping wood. But of course, in the process, all these slivers come. Uh, and the slivers are almost like they're the discoveries. But the main thing we're doing is not trying to make the slivers. It's just we're chopping wood because that's what we do. And that's what we enjoy doing together. And just as you say, it's the day-to-day victories, which are generally very, very small, and the day-to-day failures, which overwhelmingly outnumber the successes, because failure, as we all know, is a huge part of ultimate success. So yeah, for me, it really is all about that journey and getting up in the morning, going in, having a sense. Another thing is a sense not even just of optimism, but of expectation that something good is coming. Of course, most days it isn't, but it doesn't matter. Every day I go in thinking this is the day. Something's coming around. I don't know what it is. I'm on the lookout for it, and that's a big part of serendipity. Is a big part of being successful. I think at anything. But serendipity falls on everybody's plate from time to time. But some people it seems to uh, favor more than others. But I don't think it does. I think they're just more attuned to recognize it when it happens. And if you're expecting it, you're much more likely to notice it when it happens than if you're always expecting the worst.
So I'm going to pick up on that in a second. Just before I do, you mentioned earlier you didn't want to offend any Swedes who might be watching and listening to us. Well, I've got news for you that Nick Johnson from Sweden, although he lives in Singapore now, is watching on Facebook. But the only thing he said is fantastic. So I don't think you've offended Nick. He's enjoying it.
Okay, good. No offense intended. And as they say, some of my best friends are Swedes.
Yeah, absolutely, and mine too, including Nick. He's a great guy. I want to pick up on that expecting serendipity because when you're mentoring, I think there's a really strong balance to find between encouragement and support and being there for someone and positivity and being able to be brutal when you need to, be really clear. Again, the session this morning, the first task was who was the mentor that made the biggest impact on you and why, and the first person who answered said they gave me brutal feedback in complete honesty. So you need to have a relationship which allows both. So I guess the question is, where's the balance? Is positivity more important than critique as a mentor? Is it a fundamental prerequisite for being able to give honest feedback? Where's the balance between the positivity and the encouragement and the feedback and brutal honesty that a mentor really needs to give?
Great question. So let me tell you a couple of stories from my background, and then how I've tried to deal with it in my own mentoring. One of the most important teachers I ever had was a high school English teacher, Mrs. Gordon, at the Bronx High School of Science. I took something called AP English. That stands for Advanced Placement English. These are courses that you take in high school, but you can get college credit. They're advanced courses, depending on how you do on a standardized examination. So I took AP English with her, and the main uh, part of the course was learning how to write clear and effective English. And she didn't like my style. And she made that clear. And classmates realized, for some reason, she just didn't like my style, and she was brutal with me. Uh, and in fact, she had this uh, annoying thing she did that before the end of the semester, she predicted what our scores would be on the standardized exam. And they were, five was best, four was next, and three. Nobody got lower than a three. But to get college credit, you needed at least a four, and a five, you would get more credit. Anyway, so she predicted a lot of fives and fours. For me, she predicted a three, one of the few people. Anyway, I wound up getting a five, and I really sort of stuck it in her face. But so she was brutal, but I never learned as much from anybody about how to write than I did from her. So that was good, and it motivated me. When I was at the NIH having my first research experience, I had two mentors. One of them was, they had completely opposite styles. One of them was uniformly upbeat, positive. I could do no wrong. No matter how simple a task, if I accomplished it, you'd think I was going to win the Nobel Prize. Totally uncritical as well. The other guy was the opposite. Didn't matter what I did, he would point out what was wrong with it. I'd show him some data that the first guy was all excited about. This guy would say, he was excited about that? Wait a minute. Did you do this control? No. Did you do that control? No. Did you do any control? Well, not really. Get out of here, he'd say. We can't even interpret this. So it was two completely opposite styles. Now, what I realized was that they're both important. And so in my own mentoring, I've tried to incorporate both. And if I had to say which is more important, you can't really, but yeah, the positivity has got to be there. Without the positivity, they can't thrive. So this is one of the most difficult aspects of mentoring, is how to balance being critical with being encouraging and positive. Uh, and even in the most ridiculous situation where somebody brings me a completely ill-conceived experiment with an uninterpretable result, I'll try to find some positivity, but then I'll bore down on just what's wrong with it. But that is one of several difficult lines that one has to tread in mentoring. And I think I was very fortunate in having mentors with opposite styles, even though in retrospect, I think they both would have done better to have drawn some of the opposite. But I have tried to incorporate both styles into my own mentoring. And let me go one step beyond that to a much more general point about mentoring and role modeling. And that is, negative role modeling is as important as positive role modeling. What I mean by that is some of what I view as my most positive traits as a role model and mentor are things that I do specifically because I observed the opposite in a mentor and said to myself, that's not the way to do it. I understand what he or she is doing, but boy, do I think that's bad. And someday when I have a chance, I'm not going to do it that way. So you need to learn from the negative role models that you have as well as the positive.
Yeah, I can relate to that as well. When you talk about your high school teachers, there's another story in your book that I think fits here as well. Because you talked about a high school football coach who used to break down the players at half time, then rebuild them for the second half. And you actually
Right.
say that you use some of those methods with your own trainees when they were struggling. So, what did you actually transfer from the locker room to the lab, if you like?
Yeah, what I did transfer was that I thought, although I understood what he was doing, I didn't like it. I thought it was way too heavy on the tearing down, and not, and he wouldn't tear them down in a way that was constructive. Okay, so this was to me an example of negative role modeling. He would just tear them down, tell them what idiots were, boobs, how stupid they were, rather than saying, okay, on such and such a play, when you did this, wouldn't it have been better if we went that way? He didn't do that. So I think the main thing I transferred was that, well, it's good to do both, but I thought this guy was way out of whack. He was like 9 parts tearing down and maybe 1 part building up. I thought he had the ratio completely backwards, and so that's what I took from that.
So an element of negative role modeling there as well. You take the
Yeah,
best from what you see, but you make sure that you
exactly.
adapt it.
And that's what I've always tried to do is take what I like. I could give you many other examples of negative role modeling. Uh, Another one was another mentor I had when I was in clinical training after the NIH was a brilliant physician scientist who spent at a young age spent so much time on administration and leading a big program that it so detracted from what he accomplished in the laboratory. And I remember thinking to myself, not the way I'm going to do it. This guy is too unfocused. If he would just focus more on the laboratory, he could. And he's so brilliant, he could achieve so much. And he did achieve a lot. But to tell you the truth, compared to his potential, at least as I saw it, he never fulfilled it.
Okay, I want to move on and look at the role of your professional relationships generally in getting you to that position where you won the Nobel Prize. How important were the networks you build across the scientific community to help you develop your research? Because I know that once you reach a certain stage, you need to be plugged into those global networks to really make any progress.
It's interesting when I look back at my career, uh, and I don't mean this in any way in a egoistic or self-serving thing. At the beginning, I was not really all that concerned about networks. I was kind of an outsider in the field, and because I didn't come from a scientific lineage that seemed to be driving the field that I tried to enter. Plus, I was, in retrospect, and without knowing it at the time, creating a new field. And so I was kind of creating my own network. And that grew over the years. But of course, by definition, as a scientist, I would go to lots of scientific meetings. I would meet other people. And at key stages of my career, we would do collaborations, which led to breakthroughs, which we never could have done with just the resources within my own laboratory. Science has increasingly over the decades become a very multidisciplinary enterprise. So those larger networks, but because I was placing my people, all over the world, and they were becoming leading scientists in their own right, that gave me entrance to all kinds of networks that they had. So it would sort of ramify. Whatever network they had, I could sort of tap right into. And then, my goodness, once you win a Nobel Prize, it's a whole different order of magnitude. Anybody is happy to collaborate with you, or work with you. I mean, it really is pretty amazing.
From the work that I've done and the friends that I've got in the scientific community, I would venture to say, and you could shoot me down for this if I'm completely wrong, I would venture to generalize that it's a more introvert than extrovert community in terms of personality. Not sure I would necessarily place you now in that fold based on this conversation, but appearances can be deceptive. You don't get to know the whole person. If that is the case, and as I say, correct me if I'm wrong, but if that is the case, do you think that a lot of people are where you were when you started your career and were quite happy just working on their own project? And is it something that people grow into as it happens naturally, or are scientists having to force themselves out of that shell because they need to engage with those networks more?
Well, that's a very perceptive question, and I'm going to give you a perfect example of this. You could not have two more opposite personalities than myself and Brian Kobilka. So Brian Kobilka was my research fellow in the 80s. He was a cardiology fellow, just as I had been a generation before. And he would go on to become a professor at Stanford and share the Nobel Prize with me for work that he did in his laboratory at Stanford. As you have discerned, I'm rather extroverted, comfortable with people, love interacting with people. Brian is introverted and very, very shy, probably the shyest person I've ever had in my laboratory. And yet, ultimately, the key to his success and his Nobel Prize-winning work, which really went on in the 90s and 2000s, was his ability to form global uh, collaborations with several different laboratories who had expertises that he did not. But he had a vision and he had his expertise. But his vision and his expertise, no way would have gotten him to where he wanted to go. And so he was able, through, I guess, force of personality and scientific diplomacy, to attract these other leading scientists to become members of his team and to ultimately make a great scientific advance. All of this while operating as an introvert and somebody who's very, very shy. And it has always struck me as a remarkable feat that very few people appreciate, that he was able to overcome that shyness and that introvertedness to basically, almost ironically, be successful by networking with these other scientists and bringing them into his to share his vision and to work with him. And so that's a perfect example to me of just what you described, of having to overcome a natural inclination.
Yeah, I wonder how much of it was the focus of what he needed to achieve helped him. So if he needed to talk to someone to achieve his objective, he could do it. If you put him in a dinner party or a conference, an event like that, without a purpose, he would have struggled a lot more.
I think you're exactly right. He was absolutely driven toward a certain goal. And I think that allowed him to make sort of this superhuman effort to do what he needed to do.
Okay, so speaking about being driven towards a particular goal, one of the things that comes out very strongly as you move in the book towards that Nobel moment is the competition between you and another lab to get, or another team, to get the results you were looking for and the discovery that you were looking for. How important is that competition in pushing you towards success, and how do you strike the right balance between competing and collaborating? Because you just talked how Brian achieved so much through collaboration. So where's that balance between the race to be first against the cooperation to get the best result possible?
Yeah. So I think there's no denying the fact that scientific competitions have been a driving force for many, I don't know if I could say most, but if you take the most important scientific discoveries, say those leading to Nobel Prizes, more times than you would imagine, there's been an intense, often very personal scientific competition. Uh, Why is that? Well, I think people are inherently competitive. And in general, in science, uh, the big questions are apparent to a lot of people. So it's not like, let's go back to, say, one of the most important, or some would say the most important scientific discovery in biology in the last 100 years, the double helical structure of DNA by Watson and Crick in the 50s. Everybody knew that in understanding what the structure of DNA was, uh, whatever that was, might lead to a revolution in our understanding of genetics. So you had some of the finest minds in the world racing to get there. In that case, the competition came down, to Watson and Crick and one other scientist, and they battled mightily, and Watson and Crick won. Ditto when people were trying to figure out, well, okay, once the structure was known, how does that lead to the replication mechanism? How does DNA copy itself? Which has to do with what's called the triplet code, the fact that every 3 nucleotides in a row is a code for one amino acid. And again, there was a huge race. Again, it led to a Nobel Prize. And there are many, many examples of that. So I think so that's the good side. I mean, because it really propels people to want to get to that goal, just because that's human nature. Now, can it go too far? Absolutely. It can go too far when there are personal animosities, which develop and then last a lifetime, or worse yet, if there's unethical behavior, maybe stealing ideas or things like that. So yes, it's nice to strike a balance, but when you're in the heat of battle, so to speak, it is very intense. But the positive feature is that it does drive the scientific process, and discoveries which are of benefit to society can get made, more quickly. But it's as with anything else. To be successful, you have to really want it. It's interesting. At Duke, we have a championship level basketball team every year. Our coach, Mike Krzyzewski, is the winningest coach in men's basketball history, and he'll be retiring this year. And again, we have a team that's going to contend for the national championship. But anytime a team like that loses unexpectedly, as our team did just last week, typically to an unranked opponent that they had no business losing to. So now it'll be after the game, and they'll be interviewing the team captain or somebody else, and they'll say, "What happened, guys? I mean, how could you lose that game?" And the response is always some version of the same comment. It's something like, I don't know. Tonight, those guys just wanted it more than we did. That's right. You got to really want it. And, when you're playing against the number 1 team in the country, which Duke was at the time, that's a hell of an incentive, right? And so they wanted it. They really wanted it. And, that's a big part of competition. You got to be driven. You got to really want it for whatever reason.
And it's interesting you made that analogy, that connection with sports. I know you're a big sports fan, and as you were talking about the competition in the scientific space, it made me think very much about competition in the sporting fields. If you look at when world records have been broken, it's very rarely when there's been one person out on his own. Even Usain Bolt had Justin Gatling and others pushing and competing to keep him sharp all the time. So I think that across sports, where you see people go out ahead of the field, for some reason they drop back because it becomes too easy, and you need that competition to give you the edge.
I found that out myself. I was a lifelong jogger for decades. I still exercise every day, but now down in a gym in my basement, not on the roads. Jogged tens of thousands of miles, had absolutely no talent whatsoever, but enjoyed it a lot. And I ran in many 10K races and half marathons, etc. And I always found, to my amazement, that the times, that I would run when I was in a race, even though I was not contending for the race, I would finish in the middle of the pack or even the bottom third, whatever. But my times in terms of like my pace, how many minutes it took to run each mile, were far beyond anything I could ever do when I would run by myself in training. So there was just something about being in the competition with these other people that just pulls you along. So competition is a good thing.
Excellent. Okay, I'm aware of the time. We're coming towards the end of the podcast, but there are a couple of things that you mentioned in the book that I just want to ask you about quickly, and then a couple of things just to wrap it up. So in the book, that you say that a fundamental key to professional success is knowing when you're in a good situation. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Well, so I never, unlike many of my colleagues, I pretty much stayed doing the same thing throughout my career. Most of my colleagues who, had been as successful as I moved up to be chair of a department, then the dean, maybe the head of the school, whatever. I began getting office to chair departments when I was 33 years old. That was the first offer I ever got. And they continued for decades. And people always say to me, well, why didn't you take any of those? And I can't give a very good reason other than I always said, I always had the feeling that I was better at knowing what I shouldn't be doing than what I should be doing. And as all these opportunities came along, I said, things are good now. I'm enjoying myself. Why would I want to trade that in? I'll wait for when it doesn't feel good, or, I'm having second thoughts about what I'm doing, or I'm not enjoying it as much, and then I'll take advantage. But that day never came. So now I'm approaching my 80th birthday, and it still hasn't happened. So I don't know. And now I don't get the offers anymore, which, to be frank, is fine with me.
It was a point that really resonated with me, because I think some people can hit, and I'm one of them. I was for a long time hit the career ladder, and it's what's next, what's next, what's next. I remember I started a new job when I was 22, probably 21, and at the time I just needed a job, and I'd found the nearest one, and I joined the civil service, so the government service. And in my first day, my boss, the boss of the whole office, looked at me and he said, "Why are you at this level? You're qualified for the level above." And that was it. I wasn't interested in the job I had.
Yeah,
I
same
wanted the
idea.
next one. And sometimes you just, my advice to me now would be just get good at the job you're doing and prove it. And then the right one will come along in the right way. So I thought that was a very powerful point that you made. The other thing that I picked out of the book that I thought I really wanted you to share here, and I think it's closely related to what you've just said, is the importance of saying no and being
Yes,
comfortable with that.
absolutely. I mean, everybody is, if you're good at things, anything, you're going to be asked to do more and more things, which will basically take your focus away from really what you should be doing. And that's something I tried to share with all my trainees, because especially when you're young and on the academic step ladder, they certain things run downhill, and they do, and they land on the people at the bottom. So people are always being asked to do more than they should be doing, and it takes their focus away from the things they really should be focusing on. This was brought home to me in a very striking way. A story that I tell in the book is that for many years I would make teaching rounds, do clinical medicine teaching rounds, which would take me away from the laboratory several hours a day. It was like a 6 or an 8 week period that I would have to do that. But of course, I would have to travel because I had speaking commitments and meetings. And so whenever I would need to go away for a day or two, I would ask a more junior person who had trained with me, who was now on faculty, physician scientists like myself, to fill in. And of course, what are they going to say? That here's their mentor asking them to do him a favor, and so they would do it. Well, then there was one guy in particular, John Raymond, who had been a fellow with me, is now the president and CEO of a major medical center in the United States. I could always count on him. He would never, ever say no. He was a real Marine. He would suck it up and do it. So one time I called him up, and it was a little embarrassing because I was going away for a week to a meeting, and I asked if he could fill in. And for the first time, he said, "No, I can't do it." He said, I have a grant that's due on Friday, and he says, "There's just no way that I can do it." Well, I wheedled, I cajoled, I used every trick in the book. I could not move him. And finally, he said to me somewhat plaintively, he says, "Boss," he says, "please, give me a break." He says, "Look, you always told us that you need to learn to say no." To which I replied, "Yes, John, just not to me. But anyway, he stood his ground, and I was proud of him, but frustrated.
It's a hard thing to learn, but I think it's a very important thing,
Absolutely.
and people will, in the long term, respect you for it if they know that you have good reasons for why you say no. And what he did there was he explained it as well, which is key. I just want to touch on something maybe a little bit more controversial, certainly more topical. You talk in the book about the growth of anti-science feeling in the public political dialogue. We're seeing this, well, we're seeing it globally at the moment with the anti-vax conversations. It goes beyond science as well. In the Brexit debate here, we had a cabinet minister say we're sick and tired of experts. Now, I know that you were a colleague of Anthony Fauci, who's led the is it the CDC in the US, but certainly led the fight from an expert's, a scientific perspective against COVID, and he's suffered a huge amount of abuse in the States. What are your feelings about that, and what can we do generally, not just the scientific community, but everyone, to combat this vilification of experts?
Yes, this is something I feel very passionately about, and alas, I don't know what we can do about it. The first thing, first of all, Tony is a very good friend of mine, dating back to days at the NIH 50 some odd years ago. And we keep up. I've been in communication with him probably half a dozen times since the pandemic started. The vilification of him has gotten worse. The latest is he's being compared with Joseph Mengele, the Nazi doctor. I mean, this is insane. Sadly, and not realized by a lot of people, is this goes back further than just the last 3 or 4 years. If you go back to to my what's called banquet speech at the Nobel, after the Nobel, or at the Nobel banquet, which, by the way, it's so short, it's 5 minutes, is on the Nobel website. You can find it there. So that was in 2012, almost a decade ago, well before Trump. I talk about just this phenomenon, the anti-science rhetoric. I say coming from one political party. I obviously meant the Republicans. So this dates back quite a while, but it has gotten much worse. And I don't know how we combat it. All we can do is try to get out the true information. But in these days of the internet, where there's so much misinformation, and the classic phrase now is people are doing their own research, right? Doing their own research. And it's crazy. And it's almost like a religion. It has nothing to do with logic or science. And when it comes, that's just almost part of their faith. Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. In the United States, I was just reading something in the Times or the Washington Post yesterday, where if you take a map of the states that Trump won and the states where Biden won, and then you superimpose on that the vaccination rates, I mean, they almost exactly correspond. And there are a couple of exceptions, but basically states that Trump won, very, very low vaccination rates. States that Biden won, much higher vaccination rates. So it's become political. Who would have thought such a thing? And of course...
So that's what I can't get my head around, is that your party politics dictates how you feel about medical science.
Right. And there's a religious component too. Evangelical Christians, which are predominantly Republican, also have lower vaccination rates. We have a thing in our country now where there have been a number of right-wing broadcasters who have been espousing anti-vax sentiments who have died of COVID.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there was another one this week, wasn't there? I heard.
That is correct.
Yeah.
That is correct.
Yeah. Well, look, let's finish on a brighter note. I thought that was an important thing to flag because it means a lot to hear from someone who's won a Nobel Prize for their research, that it's not as simple as watching a YouTube video.
Right.
So let's finish off with the Nobel Prize. What did it mean to you, if you can answer such a question, to win a Nobel Prize? And what? Let's finish with another story. What stands out from the whole experience for you?
Well, it is a life-changing experience. In the moment that I received, I've had many friends, colleagues, who'd won the prize before me, and so I had seen, how it affected them, etc. And so I knew in the moment that I got that call from Stockholm at 5 o'clock in the morning on a Wednesday that this was a life-changing call, and it is. For one thing, it changes your name. So I'm no longer Bob Lefkowitz. I'm Nobel Laureate Bob Lefkowitz. I mean, whenever I'm introduced, and no matter how irrelevant the Nobel Prize is to whatever it is I'm doing, that's the way I'm introduced. So it does change that. People often ask me how I reacted in the moment that I learned of the prize. Was I jumping up and down? Was it like a eureka moment? And the interesting thing is that it was not. For me, I had been touted for the prize for probably 20 years, but I hadn't won it. And of course, that had been disappointing because so many people were telling me you're going to win, you're going to win. It's just a matter of time. And then they were increasingly asking me, well, when do you think you're going to win? I mean, isn't it finally time you were going to win? In fact, the first thing that went through my mind as I was being told that I had won the Nobel Prize is I was thinking to myself, this means that never again in my life am I ever going to have to answer the question, when are you going to win the Nobel Prize? Okay, and that was very reassuring. So rather than this sense of being ebullient, it was more kind of a quiet sense of satisfaction, almost relief, etc. But yeah, I mean, it does change your life. I mean, you receive so many invitations to speak and do things, and you get to pontificate about all manner of things that you know nothing about, and people actually take you seriously. That's kind of fun, but up to a limit. So it really is kind of life-changing. I think the key for me has been, as with most things in my life, I don't take it too seriously. I still have all my own insecurities that I had before the Nobel Prize. Doesn't change any of that. But on balance, would you say, was it a good thing? You betcha. I mean, and the experience of Nobel Week, I could talk to you for hours about that. But if people want to read the book, as you know, there's a whole chapter on that amazing Nobel Week and what that ceremony is like and what the whole week's activities are like. It's a magical, magical time.
Yeah, I don't think until I read it, I realised just how big an event it is. When you're there, the whole country stops for it, and I think that's
exactly people on the closest thing we have to the December 10th, which is when the ceremonies are every year. That's the anniversary of Alfred Nobel's death. The closest thing we have to it here in the United States is Super Bowl Sunday, Super Bowl weekend. Only instead of a weekend, it's a week of activities. And just like people have Super Bowl parties and then they watch the game, the tradition in Sweden is that they have banquets. People have banquets in their homes, and often they dress up in formal attire, just like the banquet is going on in formal. And then they watch the whole day's activities on TV. And in fact, in the paper, they publish the way the banquet is there's a central table, very long, 80 people sitting at it. It's called the Table of Honor. Royal family, government ministers, and all the laureates and their partners are all there. In the papers that day, they publish a seating plan so that you can watch on TV. Say, oh, sitting next to the Minister of Finance, that's going to be Lefkowitz. Or sitting next to the Crown Princess, that's going to be Lefkowitz, or whatever. So it really is an amazing national event. But there the heroes are intellectuals and scientists as opposed to athletes.
Reading the book, it sounded like an amazing event. It is a great honour. It's been great to have you on the Connected Leadership podcast. And I just want to thank you, because it is a serious thing, and this has been fascinating. The time has absolutely flown by. So thank you very much, the Nobel Laureate, Bob Lefkowitz.
Thank you very much.
So thank you very much to Bob. I've been looking forward to that interview ever since Ruth introduced us a couple of months ago, and for me it didn't disappoint. So thank you very much for joining us. Bob's book is up there on the screen. I really recommend it. It's a fascinating read, really enjoyable read as well, and so you can pick that up. A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to Stockholm by Robert Lefkowitz. So thank you very much for joining me. As I mentioned at the very beginning of the broadcast, it's a week of recording episodes of the Connected Leadership podcast for next year. So come and join us at 2:10 p.m. Not GMT, yes, GMT tomorrow, UK time tomorrow, where I'll be talking to Kelly Molson and Pauline Tenner about what can we share about our personal life with our professional network. And on Thursday at the same time as today, 3:10 p.m. UK, where I'll be joined by Leslie Everett talking about the entrepreneurial mindset for leaders in corporates, and we'll hopefully have one more for you next week before a Christmas break. We're just waiting to firm that up, but that's an exciting one as well. So thank you very much for joining us. Of course, you can go and check the archive on the Connected Leadership podcast. You can see the web address on my nameplate just underneath one of my chins on screen, podfollow.com/connected leadership. If you've enjoyed this, please say hello in the comments, post your thoughts, and I'll be keeping an eye on those as well. In the meantime, thank you very much for joining me on the Connected Leadership podcast.